Hello and welcome back. This is the week 6 lecture. So today we're talking about Do the Right Thing, written, directed, and produced, and starring Spike Lee. This is appropriate as we near the end of Black History Month because Spike Lee really is one of the most influential, important African American directors, not just of the late 20th century and not just if we're talking about independent film, but probably, I think most would agree, in just American cinematic history. Now, some could argue that we don't necessarily have to regard Lee strictly as an African American director. We can just regard him as a great American filmmaker. And I think that's definitely true. And there's also a perception of Lee, I think, sometimes that, people might view him as always as a political filmmaker who's always sort of providing, social commentary. And a lot of his films do, but not all of his films. Not all of his films are overtly political or have sort of a social message. And he really has crossed over, I would say, now to become a pretty mainstream, successful commercial filmmaker. But in this trajectory that we will and have observed a lot in the class, again, we see him start as an independent filmmaker, break through really with his first film in 1986, She's Gotta Have It. John Pearson devotes an entire chapter to that film in the book. We're not watching that film. We are watching, of course, his third film, Do the Right Thing, which comes out in 1989, that really pivotal year. Pearson devotes an entire chapter to that year and the independent film boom that took place in 89. So we'll get to that a little bit today. So this is his third film. He was becoming quite successful and visible by this point, by the late 80s. Some of you probably know who Spike Lee is, even if you have not seen any of his films, because he is just sort of a celebrity now. He's a cultural figure. He pops up in a lot of different places. He's often associated with basketball or the New York Knicks. If you are somebody who is interested in sort of sports history or advertising history, you might know Lee in part due to his commercials that he did with Michael Jordan in the 80s, Nike commercials. In those ads, Lee was reprising a character that he played in She's Gotta Have It, his debut film from 1986. But those commercials were a big part of Jordan's sort of rise to fame, and Spike Lee also got a lot of recognition from them. So part of the reason he becomes a very recognizable figure over the course of the late 80s and early 90s is the fact that he acted in many of his early films. He's obviously the protagonist, arguably the lead actor in Do the Right Thing. He had supporting roles in his first two films, She's Gotta Have It and School Days. He would later have supporting roles in subsequent films that he made, like Jungle Fever in 91, Malcolm X, the big biopic that he did in 92 starring Denzel Washington that was nominated for an Oscar. I believe Denzel Washington won an Academy Award for Best Actor in that film. You might want to double check that. It was certainly nominated, and he was nominated. So that really was a big success in 92. But over the course of Lee's career, he stops acting. He stops appearing in his own films, and to my knowledge, he rarely appears in others. He has just, sort of stuck to behind the camera work as the director of all of his films, and he's also written most of his films as well. So he wears many hats, particularly early in his career. I think Pearson points it out when he's talking about She's Gotta Have It. We're not reading that particular chapter, but it's the same case here where Lee is writing, directing, and also serving as a producer of the film. And just a quick note on the production and distribution of the film, because we have been tracking those things with most of the films that we've been watching. Lee sort of takes a page out of John Cassavetes' playbook. If you remember that name, John Cassavetes is kind of thought of as an early sort of founder or father of independent film, because he was a Hollywood actor back in the 60s who was able to create his own production company. And using the money from his acting parts in mainstream Hollywood films, Cassavetes was able to put together his own film productions, finance his own film productions, and that would be controlled through his own company. So he had total creative control, and then he would often strike distribution deals to get those films distributed. So Spike Lee does something similar. He creates his own production company called 40 Acres and a Mule Filmworks. So he's gone through his own production company, I think, pretty much for the production of all of his films. But then typically those films will be distributed by major studios, and that's the case here with Do the Right Thing. So it's produced independently through Lee's own company, but then it's distributed by Universal, or at least the distribution arm of Universal, one of those old classic Hollywood studios. And that's more or less what what Lee has done throughout his career. Producing independently and then selling his films to major distribution companies. So his films generally get wide releases. They generally play in theaters, and they've reached large audiences. So Pearson in the book is talking about helping Lee to strike a distribution deal for She's Gotta Have It, his first film. So again, we're not watching that film, so we don't need to read that chapter. Instead, I just want you guys to read that short chapter called Be Like Spike, which is just one of those like little conversational interludes that you probably noticed in the book. They often appear in between more substantive chapters, and they're just conversations between Pearson and Kevin Smith, another filmmaker who we will be watching and analyzing a little later in this semester. So read that conversation between Pearson and Smith. Smith in particular is making some interesting points about the influence that Spike Lee had on him. The influence that Lee's writing and the structure, the story structure that we can observe in Do the Right Thing. Smith talks about how they influenced him in the making of his first film, Clerks, which we will be watching soon. So some interesting parallels there. And then you guys can also read the chapter about the year 1989, whenever the year that everything changes. We talked about this a little bit last week, and I think I asked you guys to read the chapter, forgetting that it was actually assigned for this week. And last week, you guys had a very lengthy chapter to read about Michael Moore. So it's fine if you haven't read the 89 chapter yet. You're really supposed to do it this week. But I've already mentioned the larger significance of the year. And Pearson talks about it in more detail. But basically, just several successful independent films come out in that year. So I mentioned last week Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which was the debut film of Steven Soderbergh. Another, filmmaker who has gone on to be quite successful, and he's really become a pretty mainstream commercial filmmaker. And that movie made a lot more money than was expected. And then also we have Roger and Me coming out in '89. Do the Right Thing. A film like Working Girls was also pretty successful. It came out that same year. There were some other films that Miramax was involved with. So it's just a big year for independent film. So we can appreciate this film a little bit more within that sort of larger historical context as well. So, again, maybe you're familiar with Lee just sort of as a celebrity, a public figure, but you may have also seen some of his other films. I've mentioned a few of them. But like I said, not all of them are overtly, political or, sort of socially conscious in a way that we can see in, Do the Right Thing. A lot of his films are comedies, and he's not necessarily always exploring issues directly related to race and race relations in America. Many of his films do, but not all. So he's a more versatile filmmaker than I think he's sometimes given credit for. He's made films like Summer of Sam, The 25th Hour, which are really just sort of popular entertainment. They don't really pertain to a lot of the themes that we see here. Also Inside Man, which came out in '06. He did a remake of a famous Korean film, Old Boy, starring Josh Brolin. That came out in 2013. But more recently, he did The Black Klansman, which was a pretty successful film starring Adam Driver and John David Washington, the son of Denzel Washington, who has been a frequent Lee collaborator in the past. And also Da 5 Bloods was, I think, his most recent film. That was a Netflix film that came out in 2020 about Vietnam, specifically the experience of a handful of African American veterans of the war. So a very sort of varied career. He's even dabbled a little bit in documentaries. He did a documentary, I believe, about Katrina, in New Orleans, the aftermath of that. So, he's got a long career spanning, different genres. But this is early on in Spike Lee's career, his third film, and often still thought of as maybe his best film. Maybe his most fully realized work, his most powerful work. And I chose this one over She's Gotta Have It just because I think it's, probably a better film, a better representation of, kind of what Lee is all about as a filmmaker and sort of the full range of his capabilities. It's really sort of a powerhouse production in many ways. And it's just the place where people usually start with Spike Lee if we're trying to get acquainted with his catalog or if we're just trying to learn more about him as a filmmaker. This is often where one starts. I remember watching this film for the first time as a freshman, as a film studies major, a freshman in college, like first semester intro to film studies class. This was one of the films that we watched. And, it made a big impression on me. And, I think it's an important film. Lee can be a little controversial. Not everybody agrees with some of his viewpoints, some of his positions. And this film is pretty controversial. Obviously, the ending, we can discuss that. You don't have to agree with all the points being made by characters or points that we might think are being made by Lee. Although, as we're going to see today, it's a little difficult at times to parse out the message. But we can try. We can have our own opinions, certainly. But I think we should not just focus on the subject matter, though that's, of course, something that people have been talking about for over 30 years, and we can participate in that debate. But we should also think about the film as a really spectacular technical achievement. We can talk about cinematography. We can talk about production design, things like costumes. We can talk about some of the visuals. We can talk about the writing. We can talk about some of the characters. But again, we should also appreciate this film, as a technical achievement, as part of this larger indie film boom of '89. And also a good model of how Spike Lee, has done business, creating his own production company. So he has the kind of creative control that Cassavetes had back in the 60s when independent film was really first emerging. So a lot of different ways we can approach the film. But yeah, a lot of people ultimately want to talk about the ending. They want to talk about what Mookie does. Was it right? Was it justified? What's the right thing to do? We might search for solutions, but as we're going to see, resolution and solutions are kind of, hard to come by because of the thorny nature of a lot of these issues. And, a lot of this subject matter remains relevant because I think as a society, we are still working through a lot of these issues. We haven't necessarily found solutions. So that can be frustrating. I think that's kind of reflected in the film as well. But one thing I wanted to point out before we get into some more specific sort of cinematic details, or we can think a little bit more about theme as well. But just one quick note about another sort of reason this film made a big impact and was sort of novel when it came out in '89. And this is something that critics and scholars will often talk about in relation to Spike Lee's career and other films that he's made. He's often presenting or depicting what we could just consider to be African American culture, black culture, in ways that were not always done very often before he came along and before he influenced some other, popular filmmakers. So, Pearson gets into this a little bit in the She's Gotta Have It chapter, but it's very much on display with Do the Right Thing as well. So there are just several markers or sort of nods to black culture that would have been kind of new, maybe a little bit, frightening or strange to some audience members in 1989. We need to keep in mind that, at the time, there weren't a whole lot of films that centered, not many mainstream popular films that sort of centered around an African American community, a majority African American cast. Certainly, African Americans appeared in film. One could watch movies with African Americans in them, but they were often in supporting roles, and they were often rendered in fairly stereotypical ways. So a little bit similar to what we were talking about with Parting Glances back in week 2, how, prior to that film, there weren't many realistic, accurate depictions of gay life, what life would have been like for gay men in the 1980s or, in contemporary times. So that's part of what made that film noteworthy, sort of groundbreaking, paving the way for future films to continue to sort of explore, themes that had been explored for a long time with straight characters, but had not always been seen in a sort of, alternative community, different milieu. So kind of what we're seeing here, this is a look at certain aspects of African American culture that had not always been on display in mainstream Hollywood film. Black characters would have been there, but again, often serving subordinate, sort of playing subordinate roles, or, sort of presenting less than accurate portrait of black life and, aspects of black culture. So just a few things that critics pointed out were, the score, the music that we hear in the film. So a lot of it is jazz music composed, I think maybe even performed, I'm not sure, by Spike Lee's father, Bill Lee, who was a professional jazz musician. But we have the jazz sort of juxtaposed with what would have been at the time contemporary rap music, Public Enemy, namely. So again, those are types of music that would have been popular in African American communities, certain urban centers where there were large African American populations. But in the late 80s, a lot of white film goers probably didn't listen to a whole lot of jazz or rap music. Rap music was sort of ascending as a cultural force in the 80s. It was becoming more and more mainstream. But it probably didn't break through and achieve the kind of mainstream popularity that we recognize today until a little later, probably in the 90s. I mean, I'm no cultural historian, but I would argue that in 89, rap music was still viewed as a little bit of a niche sort of genre, still a little bit underground, at least in the eyes of many white viewers. So again, this would have been familiar to some audience members, but perhaps new, perhaps different for others. So the music, that iconic opening dance scene with Rosie Perez, again, that's sort of an urban dance style that would not have been familiar to a lot of white audience members. But we also have a radio station that's kind of playing throughout the film. Samuel L. Jackson portrays the DJ, Love Daddy, and that station is exclusively playing black artists. So, we hear some of that music, we hear Love Daddy throughout the film. And also, just something, a detail that might have been lost on some white viewers, and I think is especially lost on modern viewers of all shapes and colors, because it's just, we don't recognize these people in quite the same way. But there are two particular actors who would have been pretty important, sort of symbolically, for a lot of African American viewers. So Ruby Dee, who plays Mother Sister, and Ossie Davis, who plays DeMayor. I believe they were married in real life, but they were both actors, obviously older actors by the time they appear in this film, but they had had long, sort of illustrious film and stage careers. But what made them really important is not just that they're distinguished actors and really good, they obviously are, but they sort of played important roles in the civil rights movement. And they came along at a time, as actors where it was really, difficult to have a career as an actor, as an African American, at least a, long, successful, varied career. They were often typecast. They were often forced into very stereotypical minor roles. So Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, and actors like Sidney Poitier, who you might be familiar with, he just died recently, like in his 90s. This was sort of a very important generation of African American actors because they came up during the 50s and 60s. During the Civil Rights Movement, they were all active in the Civil Rights Movement, and they were just sort of important symbolically because they had successful careers. Poitier especially really embodied this. Some of you might be familiar with him. He stopped acting probably like in the 90s, but maybe your parents or your grandparents are familiar with him. He's known for some pretty popular Hollywood films of the 60s, like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night. He often played very distinguished, stately characters, which was different than what black actors had traditionally been forced to do. So he was really this beacon of hope and light, because he portrayed these really admirable characters, and even a lot of white audiences really liked him, and, his movies were successful, and he was the star of a lot of these films, and that's what was different. A lot of African American actors just had not been afforded the opportunity to be a lead, to be a star performer. So that was just an important generation. Again, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee weren't quite as popular as Poitier, but they were a part of that same generation and they were doing a lot of the same work. So it's not just that they're good older actors who are well cast in their roles. They had sort of a larger cultural or sort of social importance for a lot of African American viewers and some white viewers who might have been, active or knowledgeable about the civil rights movement as well. So kind of important to note that, just a small detail that's easy to miss, but kind of important to keep it in mind. And just remember that in the 80s, even though we're here at the end of the 80s, there had not been a whole lot of mainstream films that authentically portrayed African American culture and life. And so Spike Lee is doing that. And now I would argue it's more common, although still maybe there's work to be done. But again, Lee's influence is kind of impossible to ignore. He's paving the way for a lot of future African American filmmakers to explore a lot of this same kind of stuff. But we can also acknowledge some of the technical achievements here. Like I was saying, it's really kind of a visual delight. So we could observe some things about cinematography. The cinematographer is Ernest Dickerson, who was a very well-known cinematographer, worked with Spike Lee on a number of films, did some other stuff, and like many successful guys in his line of business, he eventually went on to become a director. So we can notice a very active sort of mobile camera. It was described by critics at the time as kinetic and exciting. So we can notice tracking shots, pans, but also, and this is something Dickerson did in some other films as well, there's often sort of an askew kind of tilt or angle to a lot of the shots that we might notice. Things are a little bit off balance almost. Again, sort of askew, tilted, leaning at times. We might notice some of that. There's some dramatic zooming. We might notice that. And also, we have characters at times speaking directly into the camera, which often has a very pronounced effect. So we can notice cinematography, we can notice the production design by Wynn Thomas. Notice a lot of the colors that are being used here in the sets, what we see, out in the streets, the places where the characters sort of congregate, hang out. You might notice a lot of reds, a lot of oranges, other bright colors. And then also another thing that was really celebrated when the film came out was the costume design by Ruth Carter. And Carter, like a lot of the other, professionals working on the film, she worked with Spike Lee on a number of other films as well. I believe Carter was at least nominated. She might have won an Oscar for Best Costume Design in Malcolm X, which came out a few years later. So again, these are really established people, within their respective areas. They worked with Lee a lot, got a lot of recognition. So costumes are interesting. Production design gives you a lot to think about. And also music, plus cinematography. There's a lot to analyze in all of those fields. But we can also talk about story and structure because Lee is also the screenwriter here. So we can think a little bit about how this story is assembled, how it functions, because it's kind of a traditional classic setup or structure in many ways. And you guys will notice that Pearson and Smith are talking about that in the Be Like Spike chapter. And Smith's talking about how the structure of the story really influenced him as a young filmmaker, because it's a sort of day in the life structure. Almost all of the action takes place in a single day. And it's all pretty much taking place in a single location. Not the exact same location, but we stay in this neighborhood, Bedford-Stuyvesant, also known as Bed-Stuy, a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. Everything takes place in the neighborhood. Now, we have different locations within the neighborhood. We're in Sal's Pizzeria. We're in Tina and Mookie's apartment. We're on the street. We might be at the radio station at a few moments with Love Daddy. We're in some other locales. We have our Greek chorus, those three older guys who kind of hang out outside of the corner store run by the Korean shopkeepers. That's kind of an important location as well. But this is all contained within a few city blocks. We are within this neighborhood for the entire film. And again, it takes place basically in a single day. So Smith says that was really good for him as a young screenwriter to observe that structure because it's kind of more easily attainable, especially for a first-time filmmaker who doesn't have maybe the budget for a lot of locations or a sort of epic sweep of time. Because the more time you're trying to cover, the more setups you need, different costumes. You might even have to show the actors like aging. If you're trying to show the passage of time, you'll have to shoot stuff, maybe during different seasons. So there's all these challenges when it comes to covering a big stretch of time with, a big cast, multiple locations. The more shooting locations you have, the more money you have to spend. So for a young indie filmmaker, being able to keep all of the action contained to one general location and then have it all take place in the same day, that means everybody can pretty much, wear a lot of the same clothes. You can have a lot of continuity, and it's just a bit of an easier thing to obtain as a young sort of broke filmmaker. So Smith notes that and says that it influenced the way he envisioned and wrote Clerks, his debut film. And they mentioned the three Greek unities, the unities of time, place, and action. And they mentioned that Lee really is kind of adhering to those classical Greek theatrical concepts. Those are kind of handed down to us from ancient Greece. I would say he's not quite sticking to the unity of action, perhaps, because maybe because the action's supposed to be completely self-contained within that one place in that very narrow time span. And I don't know, to me, there's a resolution that's yet to come. And even though it might seem like all the action takes place in a single day, I think we could argue that a lot of the anger, a lot of the resentment, a lot of the tension that ultimately leads to the violence and the explosive outcome at the end of the film, a lot of that has already been in motion for a while. It didn't just start on the morning of this particular day. A lot of this stuff was under the surface. It was simmering, but over the course of this one day in this one neighborhood, it erupts, it boils over, and it suddenly comes to the surface. So we can obviously observe that as we track the plot. But yeah, just interesting that this is inspirational for Smith and other sort of young writers because it seemed possible. A lot like what Smith said about Jarmusch and his visual style in Stranger Than Paradise, that stationary camera. It seemed possible. It seemed doable. Here, it's the story structure. which seems doable, seems possible for an aspiring young filmmaker. I would say technically this film seems a lot more advanced perhaps than some of the other things that we've watched. A lot more polished. And again, Lee had this production company, was able to finance his own films. He had investors, he had other sources of money, but clearly his budget is bigger than Jarmusch's, bigger than a lot of the other films that we've seen. But this is still, a film that's on a relatively, in terms of the structure, it's on it's kind of on a manageable scale. It's a manageable scope and scale. But the story has so much symbolic importance. It taps into so many larger issues that go beyond just the events of the film. So I think that's notable as well. All right, so we can think a little bit about the characters, our cast. Obviously, Mookie is our lead, portrayed by Spike Lee. Some critics were less than enthused about Lee's acting early in his career. I think there could be some good reasons why he, stopped acting after a while. Probably not really his strong suit. He's better as a writer and a director, but I think he portrays Mookie pretty effectively, and I think his relationship with Sal is really interesting to observe. Sal is played by Danny Aiello, who died not too long ago. He was a very recognizable actor in the 80s and 90s. He had a particular image that I think matters in the film. It matters to the character that he's portraying as Sal, the owner of this pizzeria. Aiello often played Italian. I mean, he was an Italian American, and he often played Italian American characters. And according to who you talk to, I mean, people have different opinions, of course, but some would argue that Aiello and other Italian American actors like him were often typecast or, placed in sort of stereotypical roles, often reserved for Italians in American films. He played gangsters or cops, or in this case, the owner of a pizzeria. And there are people who would argue that there's a long tradition of Italian Americans being portrayed sort of stereotypically in American cinema, and that's probably true in many respects. So Aiello had this sort of image. He played a lot of stereotypical Italian guys who were kind of tough and macho and, wore jewelry and, wife beaters or whatever, like the undershirts. And again, we can view some of that as stereotypical, but we can also just view it as, at least here in the film, maybe sort of appropriate to the character. But we could certainly argue that maybe it's not the most nuanced portrait of Italian American characters, but Sal is very complex, I think. I mean, he is stereotypical in a lot of ways, but I think his relationship with Mookie is rather complex. It's a little bit paternal in some ways. They certainly feud a lot. They sort of have a combative relationship, but we might think of Sal as kind of wishing the best for Mookie or wanting Mookie to do well, sort of looking out for him to a certain extent, which makes the events of the end of the film, at the end of the film, to some viewers, it's very painful to watch what happens, to see Mookie throw that trash can. To some viewers, it might feel like a betrayal based on his relationship with Sal. But it is a complicated relationship, and they don't seem to necessarily dislike each other. They disagree, and we can talk more about the end of the film and whether or not they come to some sort of understanding. That's certainly up for debate. But we also could notice Sal's relationship with Mookie's sister, Jade, who is portrayed in the film by Spike Lee's real-life sister, Joy Lee. And Jade is this very sort of level-headed character, not super well developed, but just seems very sort of self-possessed, maybe a little more level-headed than some of the other, pizza goers. And she also seems to have a relationship with Sal, or like he seems to have a lot of affection for her. Again, we might view that as paternal in sort of a good way, or we could also view it as a little bit creepy, maybe, and inappropriate as well. I think that's very much open to interpretation. How exactly does Sal view her? How does he view Mookie? He's a very interesting character to analyze. And then he has his two sons, of course, Pino, who's a virulent racist, not a very complex character. He represents sort of overt, violent racism, I think, sort of, out in the open. And a pretty unlikable character, but he's played by John Turturro, who has gone on to be a very popular character actor in a lot of successful American films. He often appears in the work of the Coen brothers, so you maybe seen him in some of the Coen's films. And the other brother, Vito, who's much kinder, much more sympathetic, a genuinely nice guy, and we should recognize him. He's, of course, played by Richard Edson, who we saw in Stranger Than Paradise playing Eddie. And Edson is just kind of known as, for playing nice guys, kind of just laid back, affable, sort of likable guys. That's what he does in Stranger Than Paradise. That's kind of what he does here as well. So we get this sort of full spectrum with Sal and his two sons. Obviously, Pino is a racist, and he has very prejudiced, ignorant views, and he's pretty open about sharing them. Then we have Vito, who does not seem to be stricken with any real race hatred, seems like a nice guy. And in between them, I think we can locate Sal. He doesn't seem free of prejudice, but he also seems very proud of his business, the fact that he's been serving largely African American and Hispanic customers for a long time. Again, his location within the neighborhood seems to be a source of some tension, but it's complicated, right? His pizzeria is very popular. People go there all the time. People like the food. But again, this is a majority African American and Hispanic neighborhood. Sal and his sons don't live in the neighborhood. They live elsewhere in the city, and they drive here, as we see in the beginning of the film. So this is a sort of a running feature that I think we can explore. This is sort of a through line, this idea of outsiders coming into the neighborhood and how that's perceived by the natives of the neighborhood. So we see it a little bit with Sal and his sons. Yeah, this pizzeria has been here for a long time. It's an institution. The people who live in the neighborhood like the pizza. They come here a lot. And they sort of have a certain amount of banter with Sal. In the early part of the film, it can feel a little bit playful, a little bit comic. But then we notice how things turn. Another thing that Smith points out in his conversation with Pearson, the film feels like a comedy early on. This is how a lot of Spike Lee's movies are. And then boom, something major happens, and suddenly the stakes feel higher and everything gets a lot more serious. So in some ways, this pizzeria, it is an important part of the neighborhood, but Sal and his sons represent something that's kind of outside of the neighborhood, separate from the neighborhood. The same could be said about the Korean corner store, because we see there's tension there. There's resentment on the part of some of the residents of the neighborhood. They have some resentment towards those Korean store owners. Why do they get to come in here and run their own business, make money off of us? They're not locals. They're not from here, right? They're not from the neighborhood. And then we get that scene where Bugging Out and some of the other members of kind of the local group, they follow that white guy with the bicycle who's wearing the Larry Bird jersey, kind of a famous scene. The guy scuffs Bugging Out's shoes, which makes Bugging Out pretty upset. They follow the guy to his brownstone as he's going up the stairs. In an interesting scene. Again, it's played for laughs largely, I think. It's part of the larger sort of comedic lean that we see through much of the early part, really for a good bulk of the film until we get closer to the climax. But it's a really telling moment. It's small, but it speaks to a larger trend. It speaks to gentrification, really. I mean, I don't think it's just a matter of this guy scuffing the shoes. There's also kind of a sense that he doesn't belong there. What are you doing here? You're an outsider. And I believe Bugging Out towards the end of the confrontation, or somebody else says, why don't you go back to Boston, because he's wearing the Celtics the Larry Bird Celtics jersey. Remember, Spike Lee, a huge sports fan, he incorporates a lot of sort of sports iconography into all of his films. This is no exception. So like, go back to Boston, and the guy's like, but I'm from Brooklyn. So again, this speaks to something that has very much happened in New York City. And we talked about it a little bit earlier in the semester, but gentrification. The fact that a neighborhood like Bed-Stuy has really changed a lot since this film came out, since the 80s. And we might be somewhat familiar with the neighborhood. It's just kind of attained a certain cultural status, I think. It's sometimes known as the birthplace of the notorious B.I.G., a sort of very famous rapper from the 90s. It's often mentioned in hip-hop and other sort of, cultural work. But the neighborhood and a lot of New York City neighborhoods have changed, quite a bit over the last few decades, and we probably are familiar with what gentrification is. I don't need to talk about it at length, but that moment in the film speaks a little bit to what might start happening more and more. Again, it's kind of a joke because the white guy is actually sort of from there. Like, he's from New York, maybe he's from Brooklyn, but he's not from that neighborhood. At least that's the perception. He's like Sal. He's like the Korean shopkeepers. He's coming into the neighborhood from somewhere outside of the neighborhood, and he seems to have certain privileges or abilities to do things that might be denied some of the people who actually live and have lived in the neighborhood, were born into the neighborhood, the African American and Hispanic residents who we see throughout the film. So there's that tension as well, this idea that others are coming into the neighborhood to run businesses, to profit off of us. And then there's the case of the white guy who can buy a brownstone, he can move here, is sort of the idea. Again, we don't know his backstory. He's a very minor character, so we don't know anything about him really. But it seems like what the group kind of assumes is that he just moved to the neighborhood, had the money to just buy one of these properties and can just own it by himself, conceivably, and he can just live there and have a level of comfort and ownership, because a lot of the neighborhood residents probably did not own their property. They were probably renting. It was a low-income neighborhood, right? And we know this is how gentrification works. I wouldn't argue that gentrification is inherently good or inherently bad. It's just bound to happen. You have low-income neighborhoods where people can move in, renovate, improve things, and then, more and more people move there, people who perhaps belong to a higher, tax bracket, a higher income group. So it changes the character of the neighborhood. Some of the older residents get pushed out. New people, often young, maybe college educated white people will be moving in. And this happens a lot. It's happened in major cities. It's happened in smaller towns throughout America. It's not something that we need to be experts on in this class, but it is on display here briefly in the film. And it's part of this sort of larger trend that we can notice through the film. It's sort of one of the sources of tension. This fact that people are coming into the neighborhood and maybe they can do things that the people who have always been in the neighborhood cannot do. So that might be another contributing factor to what we see near the end of the film. But obviously we can think about Bugging Out, we can think about Radio Raheem, and some of the other characters that we see throughout the film. It's a pretty big cast. We see Stevie and sort of the Puerto Rican group. They're also represented. And then I mentioned Mother, Sister, and DeMayer, sort of, older, sort of representing an older generation, and we can notice some generational tension as well. And we have that Greek chorus of the three older guys who I mentioned hanging out outside of the corner store, kind of, providing commentary on what's going on, and also at times some comic relief. there's a lot we can do with characterization, because all of these characters, I think especially the main characters, Mookie, Sal, maybe even Bugging Out and Raheem, they're complex. We don't have a lot of traditional heroes here. Mookie might sort of be positioned as that, but we hear him criticized quite a bit by the women in his life, Tina, his sister. Sal has certain admirable qualities that we might latch onto, but in other ways, he might be deficient. So it can be difficult, I think, to navigate the characterization. These are real people, right? There's a lot of unlikable qualities on display in a lot of different characters, which I think is true to life. Most people are a combination of likable and unlikable things. So a few scenes that you could dig into, the who's your favorite scene between Mookie and Pino is very famous. It got talked about a lot when the film came out, as Mookie is sort of underlining the fact that Pino likes a lot of African American athletes and entertainers, but remains very racist towards black people in his everyday life. So Mookie sort of pointing out the contradiction there, pointing out the paradox, and sort of, poking fun at Pino. But again, that's thought to be a scene that's very, expertly sort of crafted at showing how a lot of racism could coexist with fandom in some cases, and how it wasn't a contradiction to Pino, but of course for Mookie it was absurd. It was ridiculous. We also have that montage of racial epithets that we hear where the characters are addressing the camera. They are speaking directly into the camera, and that's a reminder that the racism and the prejudice that we see on display in this film, it cuts in a lot of different ways. There's not just one kind of racism on display here. So obviously Spike Lee is very interested in exploring the effects of racism against African Americans and the African American community. We can observe that. But in that montage, we also see that the racial animus cuts in multiple directions. Some black characters are prejudiced towards the Koreans or towards the Italians. We hear the white cop insult the Puerto Ricans. So there's a lot of different prejudice, and it's shared by a lot of different groups. There's distrust, there's animosity, there's stereotyping, rampant stereotyping, and there's a lack of understanding. There's sort of a lack of dialogue. But again, it cuts in a lot of different directions. So we're reminded of that, I think, often throughout the film. And again, we can think about tone. The often comic tone of the early part of the film, it really turns. Like Smith says, it's a comedy, and then boom, something happens. Something very serious, something very real happens, and it forces the audience to kind of stop, maybe reconsider, recalibrate, so we can decide if we have that type of experience as viewers. And Smith mentions that he tried to do something similar in his original script for Clerks, his debut film. He also a comedy, but Smith wanted to kind of make a similar move towards the end of the film. He wanted something very serious to happen that would sort of jolt the readers out of their, or the viewers, I should say, out of their sort of comedic spell and make them consider something of greater import. But Smith argues that he's just not, quite that kind of writer. He doesn't have the ability to do that in quite the way that Spike Lee does. So that's an interesting admission by Smith. He can't quite pull it off. He also claims that he's not a very good political writer. He can't incorporate political themes the way Lee does, and he can't perform that kind of maneuver in quite the same way. So that's interesting to consider as well. So yeah, everything kind of erupts around the 90-minute mark. That's around the point where Sal has that violent confrontation with Bugging Out and Raheem in the pizzeria. And again, sort of typical of the film itself, the overall conflict between Sal and Bugging Out, it kind of begins a little bit comically, maybe it feels a little bit low stakes or lighthearted, but it gets increasingly serious over the course of the film. And, it starts with this objection that Buggin' Out makes, and I think he's speaking for some other, neighborhood residents who frequent the pizzeria, when he points out that on, Sal's wall of fame, it's only Italian Americans. There are no pictures of African Americans or Hispanic, Latin Americans. It's just, Joe DiMaggio and like Frank Sinatra. And Sal makes the point, which I think is valid for many, that, hey, it's my place, it's my business, I own it, I made it, I can hang up whatever pictures I want. But the point that Buggin' Out and later Raheem and others make is that, yeah, but your customer base is pretty much exclusively African American and Latino. So why shouldn't we be represented? We're the whole reason your business exists. We're the whole reason you make money and are successful. So why shouldn't we be represented alongside some of the Italian Americans? So that's kind of the root of the debate. And Sal thinks that he has complete, autonomy to do what he wants in his own business, whereas Buggin' Out and others want more consideration for the customers, them, who have been loyal customers for a long time. So, we can come down wherever we come down in that particular debate, but just kind of keep in mind that's kind of how it starts. And initially, some people not everybody's really taking Buggin' Out all that seriously, but eventually Raheem joins with him and it does get serious, but it doesn't feel like it's just about the pictures, right? There's all these simmering tensions that have already been in place. They've already been sort of at work. And the events of this day are just sort of serving, as a catalyst to kind of bring everything to a head. So, of course, that conflict within the pizzeria eventually results in the cops being called and Raheem being killed. So if we're thinking about sort of the racial fault lines that we can notice throughout the film, obviously by the climax, we see everything sort of come to this horrifying sort of peak moment of action. But again, there's so many things that have led to that. There's so many other things that we could observe in this neighborhood that have kind of led to this moment. We've already sort of walked through a lot of the distrust and sort of racial animus, but another thing that we should have noticed before this climactic scene is the constant police presence that Lee wants us to notice. We see the white cop and his partner, who I think is Latino. He's portrayed by a Latino actor. I don't know if we're ever really supposed to know the backgrounds of these guys, but just a little interesting trivia fact. The actor who plays the white cop is the son of Danny Aiello, Rick Aiello, who is also an actor much less successful than his father, but he does appear in a few pretty big films, and he plays the white cop. So anyway, we see these guys quite a bit, right? So there's this sort of constant police presence. It's a bit hostile, it seems, at times. Again, there's sort of tension, animosity, distrust, and the cops play a huge role, obviously, in what happens there at the end, what basically precipitates the riot. And what happens to Raheem, I think, should remind us of a lot of things that we've seen in recent years in the news. Young black men dying at the hands of police is an ongoing feature, of American life, regardless of, our personal views or, our politics or whatever. I think people have just sort of seen that, observed that. It's been going on for a long time. We can have different opinions about it, but, we see it here. And then we see a riot. We see Mookie throw that trash can through the window, and we ultimately see Sal's Pizzeria burned to the ground. So, of course, people have been arguing about the ending. Like I said, it's been an ongoing debate. People sort of wonder if Mookie did the right thing. Some people question Mookie's actions and wonder, why did he do that? Why did he, do something like that, which would lead to the destruction of Sal's Pizzeria. Not only do some people think he kind of has a relationship with Sal that would prevent him from doing that, but it's also his place of employment. So it does kind of hurt him in a very direct way as well. So there's been sort of an ongoing debate. Why does Mookie do it? Was it wrong for Mookie to do that? And we're obviously, free to arrive at our own opinions, and we should sort of weigh in because critics and viewers have been arguing about this stuff for over 30 years. But we should also notice the symbolic importance of what we see near the end of the riot. Or, I think we're back inside the pizzeria as it's burning to the ground. And we see Smiley hanging the picture of MLK and Malcolm X. He's hanging it up in Sal's place, kind of a symbolic gesture as the pizzeria burns to the ground. So this dichotomy between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X that kind of runs throughout the film, right? And we're reminded of that again at the end with the picture. We also get quotes from each of the leaders near the end of the film. So, they're often, these two civil rights leaders are often held up as sort of polar opposites or, sort of representative of two different views on how African Americans should, seek equality. I think we oversimplify both of them sometimes by kind of reducing them to these polar opposites, but certainly early in their careers, they did advocate for very different kinds of actions. Of course, MLK, famous as a adherent to, nonviolent, peaceful protest, civil disobedience, very much in the tradition of Gandhi and Emerson, and Thoreau. So it has a long history in America and elsewhere, nonviolent protest, whereas Malcolm X is often remembered or viewed, perhaps a little unfairly at times, as sort of very militant and more violent, or at least willing to accept violent means, less interested maybe in assimilation or less interested in sort of, blacks and whites living together harmoniously, but more focused just on equal rights, equal protection under the law. So we often hold them up as opposites, as representing these two different avenues that African Americans could sort of take in their fight for equality. But, you might know that after, sort of later in Malcolm X's career, he sort of softened his views a little bit. And whereas he had previously been a very vocal critic of King, later on, they did find some common ground, and Malcolm X sort of, I wouldn't say he repudiated all of his older views, but some of his sort of anti-white views, he did soften and he did moderate and he did, sort of point out that he could see a way, he could see a future, where whites and blacks could live together in some semblance of harmony. But of course, both men were assassinated in the late 60s, so they were not given long lives. But anyway, just their symbolic importance has to be wrestled with, particularly based on the way the film ends. And then we can also think about that final sort of exchange between Mookie and Sal. Oh, but one other thing I wanted to mention just about the riot itself before we move on and wrap things up. Just a couple of details that you might want to look for or try to notice if you missed them the first time, because maybe, again, a little bit lost on modern viewers, but during the riot, we hear some of the members of the crowd shout out a few names after Raheem has been killed. So you might not recognize what they're shouting. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context because it's important to know a little bit about this. There's kind of a larger history at work here. There's a larger historical context that Lee wants his viewers to be familiar with. So during the riot, we hear them shout the name Michael Stewart. You might hear that. Stewart was so these are like connections to real life events that, are contributing factors to what we see at Sal's Pizzeria. So Stewart was a teenager in New York City who was killed by cops, I want to say in 1981 or maybe 1982. He was like 17. He was arrested late at night. He was spray painting graffiti on the subway. And he was arrested. That is against the law, of course, but while being detained, something happened to him. He was obviously beaten, and he ultimately died as a result of his injuries. The police officers claimed that he was resisting, trying to get away, so they had to subdue him. The African-American community did not really buy that. Many others did not buy that version of events. Stewart was kind of a skinny teenager, and there were a bunch of cops who ultimately beat him to death, or at least that was the general perception. So they mentioned that. You also might hear them say Howard Beach. And that's another link to a real life event. Howard Beach is a neighborhood, I want to say in Queens, but it might be Brooklyn. My New York City geography is not great, but it's a real neighborhood where I believe in 1986, an African American teenager was beaten either to death or just severely. I can't quite remember. He was beaten by a group of Italian American teens who did not appreciate the black kid coming into their neighborhood. So these are just real life events that Lee is mentioning here. He's sort of embedding them into that riot scene so viewers understand that maybe there's more going on here than just the argument about pictures, and maybe there's more going on here than really just, it's more than just Sal. It's more than the pizzeria. It's more than Mookie. There's a larger sort of context for all of this. There's a larger context for the riot, and it does seem to go beyond Mookie and the trash can. So that's important to know. We can still, reach our own conclusions, of course, but we need to understand sort of the full picture that Spike Lee's trying to paint for us here. But again, the characters are complex. I think a lot of viewers agree with some of Sal's points about his business. He built it with his own hands. But, perhaps there's just something about Sal's business and his presence in the neighborhood that has to change. Again, maybe it's not all Sal's fault. Maybe some of it is Sal's fault based on that confrontation with Raheem and the actions that he takes and the language that he uses. Some people feel that bugging out could be a little bit in the wrong. Raheem might be a little bit in the wrong. Again, Mookie doesn't have to be completely heroic in order to still function maybe in a traditional lead way, but there's a lot of complexity to all of their motivations, to all of their actions. So there's just a lot of room for debate, a lot of room for different interpretations. And just to kind of throw it out there, Lee has sometimes been criticized for not always portraying women characters very favorably. He has been accused of some misogyny at times, particularly with some of his early films. That was true of She's Gotta Have It. The gender and sexual politics of that film really haven't aged that well. And we might notice that Do the Right Thing is largely dominated by men. But we should notice the handful of female characters that we get, again, because Jade in particular seems far more level-headed, practical, and perceptive than a lot of the other characters. She criticizes Mookie. She criticizes Bugging Out when he's trying to recruit more people to his picture cause and his boycott, right? He wants to boycott the pizzeria. And Mookie even makes a joke and says, well, you eat here, 2 or 3 times a day. How can you participate in a boycott? So again, they're not taking him fully seriously at first. And Jade makes a comment to the effect of, wow, if you could just devote your energy to something productive, maybe you could, actually make something of yourself. So she's highly critical of a lot of the guys in the sort of local neighborhood group. But also Tina criticizes Mookie quite a bit, and we can observe Mother-Sister and sort of her position within this sort of, this community. And the mayor as well. He's kind of, again, ridiculed, sort of viewed at times as a drunk, again, sort of a relic of an older generation, but he also provides a little bit of moral guidance, perhaps, sort of a voice of reason to a certain extent, maybe. So a lot of characters, a lot of motivations, a lot of actions to dissect, and it's not easy. I'm not sure if there are really any easy answers or solutions here. I'm not really sure what the right thing is. I think a lot of viewers walk away a little unsure of what the right thing is to do. What can we do about some of the racial tension, some of the prejudice, some of the anger and violence that we see in this film? And I think, that's a question that we're still searching. We're still looking for the answers. But this movie does remind me a little bit of The Thin Blue Line, just to conclude, because of very different subject matters, very different styles, but both films are interested in what happens when our institutions fail us, or what happens when these bonds that are supposed to hold us together get fractured and they break. What happens when all of these things that keep our society humming along most of the time, what happens when they break down? We see this descent into chaos, disorder, and violence. What Errol Morris wanted to see was what would happen if the criminal justice system broke down. What could happen to one man if he's sort of caught up in a system that's no longer working for him. But I think we can notice in this film, the residents of Bed-Stuy, they feel like a lot of systems are not working for them. Law enforcement's not working for them. A lot of the mechanisms of capitalism aren't working for them. Again, we don't have to agree with their perception, but we need to acknowledge their view. This is how they feel. A lot of these institutions, a lot of these social structures, they're not working for them. They might be working for the guy with the Larry Bird jersey. They might be working for Sal, who in some ways does kind of personify the American dream. Probably the son or the grandson of immigrants. He's built his own business. He's an entrepreneur. He's successful. But for the residents of Bed-Stuy, they're not getting their share of the American dream. Other people are coming into the neighborhood and taking advantage or maybe even profiting off of them, but they are not seeing the kinds of opportunities that they want, the kinds of chances that these others might enjoy. So that's the perception. That's where a lot of the anger comes from. And one day, one very hot day, when tensions get high, we see what happens. So, yeah, it's up for debate. For me, it's just largely about what can happen when all of these forces really do just sort of reach their logical endpoint. That constant police presence, economic inequality, anger, prejudice, and we see it. So I want you guys to kind of, locate yourself within this larger debate. Just one final note, we can kind of it's just a little bit of food for thought. Spike Lee's often been asked in interviews, about Mookie's actions and, how should people perceive it or feel about it. At one point, Lee was quoted as saying that the only people who really ask him if Mookie did the right thing are white viewers. He says it's often read or interpreted very differently by minority viewers or non-white viewers. So, but at other times he suggested that it's totally up, for anyone's interpretation, and he's not really comfortable weighing in one way or the other. But I just wanted to mention that, and again, how do we feel about the actions, and is it going to be at least in part based on our own background, our own lives, our own lives and our own positions in society? The only other thing I wanted to mention, and just that final scene, that final exchange, which I think is the morning after, so maybe we're not quite all in one day, but after the riot, Mookie and Sal, there's no apology, there's no real reconciliation. I don't know if there's real resolution, but is there understanding between them? I want you guys to reach a decision about that as well. Okay, so I'm sorry for the length. I'll close it here. And next week, we're going to watch My Own Private Idaho, directed by Gus Van Sant. And then we return to an African-American perspective in week 8 with Daughters of the Dust. I kind of feel like maybe we should have done Daughters of the Dust right after Do the Right Thing, but we're just sort of going in chronological order. So we leave the 80s and we enter the 90s beginning next week. So I'll see you then.